The story starts with a woman named Maria Thompson, a kind-hearted black woman who was living a peaceful life in her small town. She had a young son, Malik, who looked up to her as a role model. Maria worked hard to provide for her family, and everyone in the community knew her as a loving, hard-working mother. One day, tragedy struck. A terrible crime occurred in the town. A robbery turned deadly. The victim was a well-known local businessman, and the entire town was in shock. Authorities quickly went into action, and their search for the criminal intensified. However, in their rush to solve the crime, they overlooked crucial details and focused on the wrong person. Maria was arrested, accused of the crime, and thrown into jail. The evidence against her was flimsy at best. There were no fingerprints or DNA linking her to the scene, but she was the only suspect who had been in the area. There was no logical explanation for her involvement, but in the eyes of the public, her being black made her an easy target. Prejudices in the town clouded judgment, and Maria was portrayed as the perfect scapegoat. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Maria sat in silence, terrified, while the judge and jury deliberated. Her heart sank when the prosecutor pushed a narrative that painted her as a criminal, based purely on her race and the fact that she lived in the area. The prosecutor tried to make it seem like Maria had motive, despite there being no evidence to support it. But the public had already made up its mind. Maria was guilty. The media played a huge part in shaping the outcome. The headlines were quick to report her arrest, often referring to her in an unfair and biased manner. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Maria's defense attorney tried his best to show that there was no way she could have committed the crime, but the odds were stacked against them. Maria felt hopeless as the jury deliberated. Her life was on the line, and everything she had worked for, all the love she had for her son, seemed to be slipping away. In the end, the jury found Maria guilty, and she was sentenced to death. Malik, her son, sat in the back of the courtroom, tears in his eyes. He couldn't believe it. His mother, the woman who had always been there for him, was going to die for something she didn't do. The world seemed unfair, and Malik vowed to do everything he could to save her. After Maria's sentencing, life seemed to come to a standstill for Malik. He couldn't believe the injustice that had been done to his mother. He spent sleepless nights thinking about the trial, going over every detail in his mind, wondering where things had gone wrong. His heart was heavy with sadness, but he couldn't let it defeat him. He knew that his mother didn't deserve to die for something she didn't do. He had to do something. Malik refused to accept that this was the end. He began searching for anything that might prove his mother's innocence. He scoured the courthouse records, trying to find inconsistencies in the case that had been presented. Days turned into weeks as he worked tirelessly, trying to make sense of it all. Every small piece of information he found made him more determined to fight for her. He reached out to anyone who might help, starting with local lawyers and legal organizations. At first, no one seemed willing to take on such a challenging case. They all said the same thing. The trial was over, and Maria was guilty in the eyes of the law. But Malik didn't give up. He kept reaching out, hoping for a break. One day, a civil rights lawyer named Amanda Davis took notice of his persistence. She was known for taking on cases where injustice had occurred, and she was moved by Malik's determination. She agreed to take a closer look at Maria's case. Malik was overjoyed, but knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Amanda explained that retrials were rare, especially after a death sentence had been handed down. But she was willing to give it a try. Malik worked closely with Amanda, gathering every scrap of evidence that might help his mother. He spoke to witnesses who had seen Maria in a completely different part of town on the night of the crime. He tracked down people who could vouch for her character, showing that she had no reason to commit such a crime. Slowly, they began to build a case for Maria's innocence. Malik felt a renewed sense of hope, but the pressure was mounting. He knew time was running out. His mother's life was at stake, and every second mattered. Despite the odds, Malik kept fighting. He couldn't stop now. Every day he spent working on his mother's case. He grew more and more determined. He knew he had to save her. As the weeks passed, Malik's determination grew stronger. He spent all his time working with Amanda Davis, the lawyer who had agreed to take on his mother's case. They worked together, tirelessly gathering evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and digging into the details of Maria's trial. It felt like an uphill battle, but Malik refused to back down. Every day, they uncovered new pieces of information that made it clearer that his mother had been wrongfully convicted. Malik felt a deep sense of urgency. His mother, Maria, was still in prison, awaiting her fate. He couldn't help but think of her, alone and scared, as the days ticked by. Each visit to the prison was painful. Maria, despite her usual strength, seemed to be losing hope. Her spirit had been crushed by the weight of the trial, and she was unsure whether anyone would be able to help her. Malik, however, was determined to keep her spirits high. He reassured her that he was fighting for her, that he wouldn't stop until the truth was revealed. Together, they began reaching out to people who could potentially help them. Malik contacted journalists, hoping they would cover his mother's story. He believed that if more people knew the truth, there could be enough pressure on the authorities to look at the case again. His efforts soon caught the attention of local and national media, who began reporting on the case. The public started to take notice, and the more people who became aware of the situation, the more people started demanding justice for Maria. As the case gained national attention, Amanda Davis worked behind the scenes to appeal Maria's conviction. She filed a petition for a retrial, pointing out the flaws in the original case. She argued that critical evidence had been ignored or overlooked, and that Maria's conviction had been based on prejudice, not facts. Malik's hard work was starting to pay off. With public support building and more attention being drawn to the case, it seemed like the impossible might actually become a reality. Still, Malik knew they were up against a powerful system, one that had already sentenced his mother to death. He kept pushing forward, even when things seemed bleak. Every time he felt discouraged, he thought of his mother's face, of the woman who had always been there for him, who had cared for him and loved him unconditionally. He couldn't give up now, not when he was so close to finding the truth. As the months went by, Malik and Amanda Davis continued their relentless pursuit of justice. The petition for a retrial was finally approved, and the news spread like wildfire. People all over the country were talking about Maria's case. The rallying support grew stronger, and Malik could feel the energy in the air. Something was changing. The retrial offered a glimmer of hope, but Malik knew it wouldn't be easy. He had seen the way the system had worked against them before, and the road to freeing his mother would still be filled with obstacles. Maria, though, began to feel a renewed sense of hope. Each visit from Malik became more than just a moment of comfort. It became a reminder that the fight wasn't over. She clung to her son's words, allowing herself to believe that there might be a future for her outside of those prison walls. For the first time in years, Maria felt the light of possibility shining through the darkness that had surrounded her. Malik's efforts had made all the difference. The retrial itself began with a new sense of urgency. Amanda Davis, having gathered fresh evidence and identified key witnesses who had never been heard before, stood firmly in the courtroom, determined to make her case. The prosecution tried to cling to the same arguments, but it was clear that the case against Maria was built on shaky ground. With every piece of new evidence that came to light, the truth became harder to ignore. Malik watched from the back of the courtroom, his heart racing as he heard the testimonies of the new witnesses. Each person who came forward spoke with unwavering certainty, supporting Maria's innocence. Some even revealed that they had been too afraid to speak up during the first trial, fearful of the consequences. It was heartbreaking to think how much time had been lost, but Malik pushed that thought aside. They were moving forward now, and that's all that mattered. The public support behind the case reached new heights. Protests and petitions demanding Maria's freedom flooded social media, with people from all walks of life coming together to fight for what was right. The sense of solidarity gave Malik more strength than he ever thought possible. He was no longer alone in this fight. He had an entire nation behind him. Still, the journey was far from over. The retrial was just the beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. But as Malik sat next to Amanda, waiting for the next phase of the trial, he felt a small but powerful shift inside him. There was hope in the air, real hope, and he was beginning to believe that, no matter what happened, they could win this battle. Just when things seemed to be gaining momentum, Malik made a bold decision, one that would change everything. The retrial had sparked hope, but it was also clear that the system was reluctant to let go of its previous verdict. Even with the new evidence, the defense had to fight against the deep-rooted prejudices that had shaped the first trial. The prosecutor was still determined to hold on to the old narrative, and it seemed like the odds were stacked against them. Malik felt the weight of this struggle every day. He knew time was running out. His mother's life was still at risk, and with each passing day, the tension grew. Despite the progress, there was always the fear that things could fall apart. But Malik wasn't the type to sit back and watch. He couldn't afford to. His mother had already suffered too much, and he was willing to do whatever it took to bring her home. In a moment of desperation, Malik took matters into his own hands. He knew that the courtroom was the place where the truth needed to be heard, but he also knew that there were people, powerful people, who didn't want that truth to come out. In a dramatic move, Malik decided to take a risk that could either destroy everything or finally push them towards victory. He decided to break into the courthouse. He had heard about a set of documents, key evidence that was never included in the original trial. Evidence that could prove beyond a doubt that his mother was innocent. It was locked away in a secure file room, and no one had ever thought to investigate it thoroughly. The idea was reckless, but Malik was desperate. He knew that if they couldn't get the truth in front of the right people, his mother might never be free. That night, Malik slipped into the courthouse, his heart racing. Every step felt like an eternity, but he pushed through the fear, driven by the need to save his mother. He found the documents he was looking for and took copies. It was an unthinkable act, one that could land him in serious trouble, but he didn't care anymore. He had seen the way the system had failed his mother, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. The next morning, he presented the stolen documents to Amanda. The evidence was undeniable, and it shifted the case in their favor. The authorities, realizing that Malik had exposed their mistakes, were left with no choice but to take the new evidence seriously. The courtroom was thrown into chaos as the truth came to light. Malik's actions had shaken the system to its core. What had once seemed impossible was now within reach, and Maria's chances of being freed had never been higher. Malik's daring move to expose the truth had set everything in motion. The media was buzzing with the shocking turn of events. The courthouse break-in, once considered an act of rebellion, had now become a symbol of defiance against a broken system. People from all corners of the country were speaking out, demanding that the case be reopened and that Maria's innocence be acknowledged. What started as a quiet fight for justice had now exploded into a national movement. The whole country seemed to be watching as the truth slowly emerged. The authorities were in an uproar. They had never expected someone like Malik to take such drastic action. But even they couldn't ignore the weight of the evidence he had uncovered. The truth was undeniable. The case, which had seemed like a lost cause just days earlier, was now being reviewed in the light of the new documents Malik had brought to light. The prosecution, once so confident of their case, was suddenly on the defensive. They had no choice but to reconsider the facts they had overlooked or dismissed. Malik's decision to act, though risky, had turned the tide in their favor. His courage had ignited something in the hearts of others. People who had once believed the system was too powerful to challenge now saw that change was possible. They rallied behind Malik and his mother, calling for justice. Protests erupted in the streets, with people of all races and backgrounds standing together in solidarity. The power of unity and the collective voice became impossible to ignore. The demand for Maria's freedom grew louder each day. Despite the public support, the fight was far from over. The legal system, though under pressure, was reluctant to back down. But as the days passed, the case continued to unravel. Witnesses who had been too afraid to speak before now came forward, willing to share the truth. Every new piece of evidence stacked against the original conviction made it harder for the authorities to maintain their position. Maria, who had spent years in fear and isolation, began to feel a small flicker of hope. She had always believed in her innocence, but the years of rejection and the weight of the sentence had taken a toll on her. Now, with every passing day, that flicker grew brighter. Malik was making sure of it. As the trial progressed, Maria knew that her son's fight was no longer just for her. It was for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. The walls of injustice were slowly crumbling, and Maria's release was no longer a distant dream. It was becoming a reality. For Malik, the battle was far from over. He couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. But for the first time since his mother's conviction, he allowed himself to believe that the impossible might actually happen. His mother might just come home. As the days stretched on, the courtroom drama reached its peak. Every person in the room knew that the case had shifted dramatically, and everyone was waiting for the moment when the truth would finally be heard. The walls of doubt that had surrounded Maria's case began to crumble, bit by bit. Malik watched as Amanda Davis and the rest of the legal team presented their evidence, carefully unraveling every lie and inconsistency that had led to his mother's wrongful conviction. The media continued to cover every twist and turn of the case, ensuring that the public was never far from the truth. The stories of people who had been silenced before were now being told, and the injustice of Maria's conviction became clearer with every new revelation. Malik, though exhausted, stood tall in the background, watching the battle unfold in front of him. He could feel the weight of the situation, but his faith in his mother's innocence never wavered. The battle was long, but it was far from lost. One of the most powerful moments came when key witnesses, people who had been too afraid to testify years ago, spoke up. One witness after another took the stand, describing what they had seen the night of the crime. Their testimony exposed the truth. Maria had not been there, and the evidence used against her had been fabricated or ignored. Slowly but surely, the layers of lies fell away, revealing a case based on prejudice and rushed conclusions. Maria had been an innocent woman, wrongly convicted and sentenced to death for a crime she never committed. The jury listened intently as the defense team presented their final arguments. Maria's innocence was now undeniable, and it seemed impossible that the court could still hold on to the past conviction. The judge's expression was unreadable, but everyone in the room sensed that something monumental was about to happen. As the final words were spoken, the courtroom grew eerily silent. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment of truth. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the judge declared the verdict. Maria Thompson was innocent. The conviction was overturned, and the death sentence was lifted. The crowd in the courtroom erupted into applause. People who had once doubted her were now on their feet, cheering for the truth. Maria, who had sat through years of pain and uncertainty, was finally free. Malik rushed to his mother, tears streaming down his face. He had fought for so long, and now, after all the heartache, they had won. Maria stood, overwhelmed by the emotions flooding her heart. She looked at her son, her rock, her savior, and hugged him tightly. The bond between them had been tested in ways neither of them could have imagined, but it had never broken. In that moment, they were finally free from the chains of injustice. For Malik, the fight wasn't just about his mother's freedom. It was about justice, about making sure that no one else would suffer the way they had. He knew the battle wasn't over for everyone, but in that moment, Maria's release felt like a victory for them all. The day Maria was released from prison felt surreal. It was as if the years of pain, fear, and uncertainty had been lifted from her shoulders. For so long, she had been trapped in a nightmare that seemed endless. But now, as the gates of the prison opened, she stepped into a world of freedom that she had almost lost hope of ever seeing again. Malik was by her side every step of the way, his heart swelling with pride and relief. He had always believed in his mother's innocence, but there were times when even he had doubted whether this day would ever come. Yet here they were, walking together into a new chapter of their lives, a chapter that had seemed impossible just months ago. The media swarmed around them, capturing the moment, but Malik's focus was entirely on his mother. They had been through so much, and now they were finally able to breathe free air again. As the days passed, Maria slowly began to adjust to her new life outside the prison walls. The world had changed so much during her time in captivity, and it was overwhelming at first. But with Malik's support and the love of her family and the community, she found her way. Every small victory, like feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin or hearing the sound of birds singing, felt like a miracle. She had spent so many years dreaming of these moments, and now they were hers to experience. Malik, too, had changed. He had grown up in ways he never expected, carrying the burden of his mother's wrongful conviction and the relentless fight for her freedom. He had learned what true resilience meant, and the fire of determination that had driven him throughout the battle for justice now shaped every part of who he was. As he watched his mother find her footing in this new world, he knew that his fight wasn't just for her. It was for all the others who had been wronged and forgotten by the system. The case, which had once been a symbol of injustice, became a rallying cry for others who were still waiting for their voices to be heard. Maria and Malik's story inspired many people to stand up for what was right, to fight for the innocent, and to ensure that the flawed system would not keep people like Maria locked away any longer. The nation had seen what happened when one person refused to give up, and it sparked a movement for change. For Maria and Malik, the future was filled with new possibilities. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined who they were. They had fought through the darkest times and emerged stronger. The road ahead would have its challenges, but together, they knew they could face anything. They had already won the greatest victory of all, the chance to live their lives in freedom, side by side.